The greatest intellectual swindle of all time is what I'll be talking about. Yes, Plato's Republic, so-called Book 10, more like a chapter. I'm going to get into it here. I'm going to read part of it because it's probably going to shock you what's been left out, what's been omitted, importantly, from the talk about philosophy in general. Stay tuned till the end. So I've done a talk on the lie of the allegory of the cave and how this has been reframed or misframed. And now we're in a mess. Like, people just believe that Plato said something that is, not the exact opposite, but pretty much the opposite of what he said in the allegory of the cave. And then we've got book 8, the middle of it, basically, where it talks about what happens when democracy fails and how it falls into tyranny, and why that would be the case. And that seems relevant to today. But really, I've been holding back, and I've been talking about this for a while on the channel. I've had a hard time trying to get, my mind around this. So I did the research. I've got the notes, and I'm going to show you why this is a big deal. And book 10 is a very big deal. Okay. Book 10 is the book that people cite when they're talking about Plato doesn't like poetry. He doesn't like Homer, right? And that's a problem. But another thing, sort of a wider picture of what's going on here, which I think is super important. In here, it talks about the tension, we'll call it, between philosophy and poetry. Now, I've made this case before. I have to make it again here. If you've heard it before, bear with me. Philosophy to the ancient Greeks is the bucket of all ontologies. So all ontologies are types of philosophy. Okay? That's how they view the world. And so the things that don't fit neatly into ontologies, it's basically the arts. Poetry would qualify. Right? Poetry, not an ontological thing. You can't categorize it. I know a lot of people use ontology 2 different ways. It has 5 definitions, by the way. The 2 big ones are categorization and being. Don't use ontology to mean being. It's a complete waste of your time. We have another word for that. It's called being. Right? Much easier. So this is important because he actually brings this up. If you buy into this, what I'm basically saying is there are the things that are discernible, knowable, understandable through logic, reason, and rationality. Those are the philosophies. They all belong under the philosophy bucket, every single one of them. And then there's other things that aren't that. There's a tension with them. They're poetry, art, things, music, things like that. He mentions these things in book 10 in greater and lesser degrees, right? He mentions things like rhyme, which are important to the enchantment of poetry. Now, what we're missing here is not even that. Like, that's crime enough, we'll say, to leave out. He doesn't hate Homer. He ends up letting him back into the city, effectively. And so, and it doesn't matter, he says, because we're charmed by poetry. It doesn't make any difference if we want him in the city and we try to banish him from the city, this poetry thing, because we have to let Homer back in because we're charmed by him. Okay, fair enough. So in your ideal city, you have to have poetry. And the book ends almost exclusively, although not exclusively, which I had made an error on earlier, with a story, which is not a philosophical story that can be justified by a philosophy at all. It is a poetic story whose design is to move you. And I will prove that by, at the end of this video, reading the very last paragraph. So I'm not going to read the story itself. It's too long and it's not all that interesting, although the topic of the story is interesting. But it's the commentary afterwards. I had forgotten there was a commentary afterwards. It's when I read it, I think you'll understand why it slipped my mind, actually. And if you don't, like, fair enough. But also, like, I think it will become very clear why this would slip somebody's mind. And so it doesn't end exactly, with the story. But the story that Plato has Socrates, the character, tell in the book is the story of a resurrection. That's what it is, explicitly. That would seem important, that Plato sort of let Homer back into the city, as it's put in the text, and then proposes this story of a resurrection. It's very suspicious with the timing of what would come later, in the form of another story of a resurrection, commonly referred to as Christianity, which makes sense in that time frame, but not post Reformation, I would argue. So let's dive into what's going on here in Book 10. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole book. It's too long. There's a book club for that. We might have rushed through it a bit. I was talking with Manuel about this the other day, but I don't think we necessarily rushed through it. There's just a lot to cover there. And maybe we weren't equipped, even with that wonderful book club, to handle the weight of this particular section of the Republic. So basically, the figure of Socrates puts forth 595c, right, a certain friendship for Homer and a shame before him, right? So there's this other idea that, that he doesn't like Homer. I mean, he says the polar opposite right here, right? And he says, a man must not be honored before the truth, right? But as I say, it must be told, right? And then Socrates is, looking for some kind of answer from Glaucon. And then what we see as this progresses is an argument is made in 596b, the nature of craftsmen, makers. There are three types. One in nature, right, which he says, I suppose, is a God-produced thing, right? So he's linking nature and the gods explicitly in the text, right? Those are the same thing, right, to him. It's explicit, right? One carpenter produced, right? And one a painter produced. And then he says these three preside over the forms, in this case, of couches. It could be anything. It could be chairs, could be tables, right? Doesn't matter. But in this case, he says couches. And what is this? So this is form, the one in nature, right? This is implementation, the one the carpenter produces, right? Or manifestation might be another way to say it. And the other one is representation. That's what the painter does. The painter represents something, right? And then the craftsman is a maker, and the painter not so much. And a god would build only one couch because you only need a single example, see Platonic forms or eidos, to have a thing. That's the case that's made. Okay? That's it, roughly 596b. That's the case that's made. This is what the book says. I agree, by the way. That sounds about right to me. And so there isn't more than one thing in nature. There's actually only one. And the question could arise here quite readily. When he says nature, does he mean the realm of forms? I don't know. It doesn't say in the book that I can discern. I might be missing something, so double check. Feel free to read it for yourself, although don't read it alone. Don't read it alone. Too deep a book. And then the case is made in 598b that the imitation is further from the truth. Okay? So the imitation and the representation are the same here. In other words, the painter is further from the truth of the couch than the craftsman, who's further from the truth than the natural couch. That's effectively what is being said here. Fair enough. That sounds right. All right? And then around 600C, if Homer could do more than imitate, his comrades would have praised him. Therefore, why pay attention to an imitator of phantoms of truth? Right? And so he's making the case basically that poets are imitators like painters, right? And he draws a direct conclusion. This is about 601E, right? He's stating basically that what John Vervaeke would call participatory knowledge, right, is king. In other words, experience is king. In other words, doing the thing is the king, right? Another way to see this is there's a manifestation, that's the craftsman, right? The craftsman does the manifestation, and that is the king of knowledge, the king of understanding, right? The direct action is the thing that conveys the most truth. And imitation is third from the truth, right? He makes that case in 602C, right? And then, his basic point is, look, if Homer were doing the things that he talked about and then wrote about them, he'd also have been praised for doing them. He wasn't praised for doing them. He was praised for writing about these things. And they're all stories that he got second or third hand. Okay, so he is an imitator of those events in the same way a painter is an imitator of the couch, which is something the craftsman built. Right. So that's basically, what he's saying. And I mean, as far as I can tell, it's correct. So, right. But in 605b, we get to this idea that judging the imitative poet by fruits produces a bad city, right? Because they cannot discern big from little, right? But they randomly pick whichever's easiest, right? By gratifying the soul's foolish parts, okay? So this is what I would call the flat world, right? Because you have an imitation, a painting is not a couch. You can't sit on it in the way you can sit on a couch. Doesn't provide the same affordance is probably the easiest term to use. That's another Vervaeke term. And, fair enough. Because you can't discern big from little, you're going to go with an easy answer that's going to make you feel better, right? The soul's foolish parts might be the ego, for example. So that idea that because you have this imitative poet and other people can't judge the poet because he's too far away from the truth, that's creating this flat world. Flat world just seems to make you want to go with your gut. Fair enough. I think that argument's correct. I think 605b is quite nice, actually. And then we get to 605d through E, right? We enjoy poetry and give ourselves over to it. Right? Just like flat out, like these things are not optional, right? We enjoy it and we give ourselves over to it. Like that's just the way the world is. According to the figure of Socrates, right, via Plato. Okay, fair. I mean, that sounds correct, right? And I would call that mimicry, right? So now we're in a little bit Girard. Fair enough, right? We suffer along with the heroes, but in personal sorrow, we pride ourselves if we keep it to ourselves. In other words, when we're reading about heroes suffering, we're right there with them. But when we're suffering, we don't share it with anybody. And I think that's deeply true. It's a wonderful observation, right? And then 607a, if we buy into Homer and poetic imitation is a thing, then there are consequences to that, right? But I think that, there are. And again, we've already established this isn't optional. We're going to be attracted by Homer. We're going to imitate Homer to some extent. Right? We don't have a choice. It's not an optional thing. You can't remove it from the world. Now, at 607b, we've spent all this time just excising poetry from the city. We've cast Homer from the city, which is a clever way of saying get rid of poetry, right? Because he's the greatest of all poets. But by 607b, we're bringing it back. We brought it back up, and now we have to bring it back in the city because it was a mistake to banish it, right? And it's an old quarrel. It's an old quarrel between philosophy and poetry, between science, philosophy, and poetry, art. We're still having that quarrel today. Maybe that quarrel's been slightly upgraded. Now, if you haven't seen my videos on education, I will try to link them here. One of the cases I make is that, yes, we removed religion from the schools. I'm not saying that's not a complete catastrophe. What I'm saying is, it's way worse. What else did we remove, or at least remove part of, from the schools? Gym, recess, music, art. Weird. Right. And we've replaced that largely with more book learning time. And that's worse, right? Replacing it with book learning time is worse. If you're just giving them the free time back, the kids, then that would be much better. But instead, they're constrained to their desks, learning more. And this is actually bad. There are studies about this. This is bad. Don't book learn your kids too much and too early. Both bad. But that is an expression of this old quarrel, right, between philosophy and poetry, or I'm going to claim science and art. I can imagine some people have arguments with that. Bring them to me. I will happily have this debate. Happily. That's a hill, and I don't think I can die if I'm standing on that hill. But hey, I'm willing to find out. Are you? So we get to 607C, and the case is made. In either case, we are charmed by poetry. Charmed. Interesting. I would put charm, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the word charmed, dead on. I love this. Again, I'm using the Bloom translation. I would put that in the class of enchantments. Just so we're clear on where I lie on enchantment. And so that's what's really important, is that it doesn't matter. Poetry is going to get you. Right? And, I've actually made arguments that that's actually not entirely true anymore, although there's ways around that, right? You'll get charmed by something, and it will have a poetic component. The question is, can you tell, little from big, right? Because that's where it all goes wrong. Can't tell a good idea about government from a bad idea about government, right? Even with historical context, which is a strange thing. Don't get me wrong. But also, we see that. We see it happening today. And so, a lot of this book is also concerned with arguments over good and bad. And the way that's entered into is in 608b. There's a great contest to be good versus bad, so don't get fooled by honor, money, ruling office, or poetry into thinking it's worthwhile to neglect justice and the rest of virtue. Indeed. And so here he's bringing in the rest of virtue along with justice. Remember, The Republic is a book about justice. It's really not supposed to solve other things, right? It's supposed to solve justice. And again, the way it's doing that, Plato is building the perfect city. Plato is building the perfect city. He's the god of the city. He's the puppet master with all the strings. That's how the book's set up. It's super explicit about this. Couldn't be more clear, right? Uses slightly different language for sure, but also it's clear. Plato and Glaucon are the ones manipulating the city and setting it up the way they want and making changes. And sometimes Glaucon's objecting to the changes he and Plato seem to be making together to the perfect city, or Socrates rather. But that's the project. They're playing gods. That's what they're doing, right? And they're explicit about it. So fair enough. Now, the character of Socrates at 608D or so through E makes a case that our soul is immortal and that what corrupts, destroys and corrupts is bad, and what saves and benefits is the good. And so there's your ethical or moral argument right there. 608D and E, right in that range. Now, he does all this basically to set this up for the end, but that's the argument that the soul is immortal. He actually goes through an argument for that. I'm not going to repeat it again. I'm not going to go through the whole book. That's not my purpose here, right? I really want to highlight the big lie of omission. Okay? Immortal soul is already pretty big, right? Like, oh, nobody told you Plato thinks there's an immortal soul, and he makes an argument for it in the Republic. It seems like really important to me. It seems like intellectually dishonest not to mention that. But, my dear friends, what is worse, and boy is it worse, is the following. Contrary to what you've been told, Plato does not hate poetry. He tells, at the very end here, and it's quite a long section, actually, of the text, a story. And it's the story of a strong man, son of Arimaeus, of some weird race, doesn't really matter, who died in war. And as they put him on the funeral pyre, his body, he woke up. That's how the story begins. So it's basically an epic tale at some level. And then he tells the story of what happened to him when he died. And it's a very elaborate story. It's a little weird. It's a little hard to follow, in my opinion. It's very strange. It's all wrapped up in the gods all over the place, right? And so, if anything, what Plato's doing is he's usurping Homer and trying to tell a better poem, a better story. And the story that he thinks is not corrupting or destroying of the immortal soul is the story of a resurrection. How very odd. Now, again, I apologize. I had said previously that it kind of ended with the end of that story, right? Which is roughly how he came to be into his body. He did not know, but all of a sudden he recovered his sight and saw that it was morning and he was lying on the pyre. Okay, fair enough, right? That loops back into the very opening of the story where it says guy gets thrown on a pyre. But then it does continue after that. Now, again, the timeline here is very suspicious because this type of story is taken up, right, by the Christian movement, if you will, probably a fair way to say it. And, you know, what the argument generally that I've heard from Christians is that, of course, they have all the stuff from ancient Greece, Plato in particular, Socrates, no problem, Stoicism built right in, Epicureanism right there, right? Because they refined it all and made it better. That's the argument. You can agree with that argument, disagree with that argument. I don't care. It's not my argument. That's what they say. It's awfully mysterious, though, that in fact, whatever came after Plato, you might be able to refer to that as, quote, Neoplatonism, did not last, but Christianity did. So if you believe in evolution, you've got your answer. If you don't believe in that answer, or you'd like to change that answer, then you're an evolution denier, and you should be called such loudly and in public. That point, by the way, was made to me rather shockingly, because I for some reason didn't see that argument coming. Very strange for me, by Dr. Lantern Jack. So I was like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that before. It's a good point. So the fact that this is omitted, right, and there's really a bunch of things being omitted here, right? Like that, I don't think anybody's ever mentioned to me that, oh yeah, in the Republic, the character Socrates makes a case that the soul's immortal. I've never heard that before. And that there is a quarrel between philosophy and poetry. I don't remember hearing that before. And that, in fact, he doesn't dislike Homer or have a disdain for poetry. He has a great respect for poetry, but and in fact uses it, right? Uses poetry to sort of correct, we'll say, the ills of Homer, or the errors of Homer, or the mistakes of Homer. Because that's what it says. Like, I don't know who read what or who skipped over what parts, but it's what Book 10 says. I don't know how else to do it. Like, I don't know what you read, but that's what it says. So maybe you should read it again, maybe with friends, maybe pay attention, and if you get the same result, maybe this book is too much for you, and you need a simpler book. I mean, that it's possible. Like, not everybody can read every book, right, and understand it correctly. So that's the big lie. Sure, there are lies by omission, but like, these are really important points, especially in this meaning crisis time or intimacy crisis time, both of which are happening for sure, precisely for that reason. Like, it's sort of like Plato. Like, Plato knew what he was writing about, and this is not, we'll say, a danger that no one saw coming, right? And he attempted to fix it, and he uses a story of a resurrection to do it. It's a little weird. It's a little weird, unless it's not. And he understands, seemingly, the difference between logic, reason, rationality, philosophies, right, and arts, which charm you, right? He seems to understand this all too well. And the reason why I missed the fact that it sort of ended with the end of the story, maybe this won't be clear to you, and that's fair. That's fair. But I will just read you the last few lines right after it says "lying on the pyre," right, which is the end of the story. And you can ponder what this means and why no one ever mentions this. Because it seems like the most important part of the book, and it's right at the end. I don't think that's a coincidence. I don't think I'm reading something in here that isn't here. But look, leave some comments and let me know what you think. And thus, Glaucon, a tale was saved and not lost. And it could save us if we were persuaded by it. And we shall make a good crossing of the river of Lethe, and not defile our soul. But if we are persuaded by me, holding that soul is immortal and capable of bearing all evils and all goods, we shall always keep to the upper road and practice justice with prudence in every way, so that we shall be friends to ourselves and the gods, both while we remain here and when we reap the rewards for it, like the victors who go about gathering in the prizes. And so here and in the 1,000-year journey that we have described, we shall fare well.